Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's Wade T. Lightheart from Bioptimizers with another edition of the Awesome Health Podcast. And today we have a living legend that is going to join us, Dr. Stephen Gundry. We're going to talk about the gut, microbiome, mitochondrial health, linking the immune system malfunctions to the mental and physical symptoms of fatigue, including exhaustion, brain fog, depression, anxiety, and low metabolism. We're going to be talking about some cool things, why you might feel fatigued or the people around you. We're going to talk about the mitochondrial rush hour, and of course, his latest book, The Energy Paradox. If you haven't heard of Dr. Stephen Gundry before, he is one of the world's top cardiothoracic surgeons and a pioneer in nutrition, as well as a medical director of the International Heart and Lung Institute Center for Restorative Medicine. He has spent the last 16 years studying the microbiome and now helps patients use diet and nutrition as a key form of treatment. He is an author of many New York Times bestselling books, including The Plant Paradox, The Plant Paradox Cookbooks, The Longevity Paradox, How to Die Young at a Ripe Old Age, and will release The Energy Paradox, What to Do When You Get Up and Go Has Gone Up and Gone. Of course, that just happened. And not that just happened that we lost our gut up and we got to the gut up and gone, but he just published that book in March of this year. He is also the founder of Gundry MD, a line of wellness products and supplements. Dr. Gundry, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Good to see you.
I love the fact that as a thoracic heart surgeon, you got into nutrition. One of my dear and close friends, I don't know if you know him, his name is Dr. Horst Filtzer, who is a cardiac surgeon. I think he was part of the Harvard team that put the first stent in the body. And I was just hanging out with him last week. And what's interesting, he was sharing with me I think he's now at around 80 years old, of how he started a garden. And he's been eating all these vegetables all the time, as it helped him drop 60 pounds. And so he decided he would open another wound healing clinic. And I think it's always great when we have people in the acute therapy, in the surgery component, which Western medicine leads the world in, also adding a responsibility side around, what we need from diet and care of the body. How did you originally come to that place in your own practice and work?
Well, back in actually towards the late 90s, I a very famous heart surgeon, chairman of heart surgery at Loma Linda University School of Medicine, kind of down the block from where you are and I am. And I was famous for operating on people that nobody else wanted to operate on. Too difficult, blah, blah, blah. And I was sent a gentleman from Miami, Florida, Miami Beach, who was 48 years old, big fat guy. I call him Big Ed in all my books. And he had inoperable coronary artery disease. You couldn't put stents in them. You couldn't do bypasses because there wasn't any place to land. And people like him would go around the country to various centers looking for idiots like myself to operate on them. And everywhere he went, I won't name the names because they're very obvious. Everybody turned him down. And he spent about 6 months doing this. And he wound up in my office. And he brought the angiogram, the cardiac catheterization of his heart from Miami 6 months previous. And I looked at the catheterization. I said, look, everybody's right. I can't help you. They can't help you. There's nothing can be done. And he said, well, hold on a second. I've been on a diet for the last 6 months. I lost 45 pounds and I went to a health food store and I bought all these supplements, and he literally brought in a giant shopping bag of them. And I'm going, well, good for you for losing all that weight, but it's not going to do anything in your heart. And I know what you did with all those supplements. You made expensive urine, which I firmly believed back then. I don't obviously now. But he said, well, come on, I've come all this way. What would it hurt to get another cardiac catheterization, movie of my heart? And, okay. So in 6 months' time, this guy cleaned out 50% of the blockages in his coronary arteries. They were gone. Now, not only had I never heard of that happening, it's physically impossible. So I go, what'd you do? Tell me about this diet you did, and let me look at these supplements. So I had the benefit back in the dark ages of education at Yale University to design my own major. And I had a special major called Human Evolutionary and Social Biology, where I basically had a thesis that you could take a great ape, change its food supply, change its environment, and predict you'd have a human being when you finished. Mm-hmm. And I actually defended my thesis and got an honors. And then I gave it to my parents and became a famous heart surgeon. And so as Big Ed's telling me his diet, I'm going, whoa, wait a minute. That's, the ancient human diet that I described in my thesis. Now, what's poignant is I was 75 pounds overweight. I was running 30 miles a week, going to the gym 1 hour a day, eating a healthy, low-fat diet, and I had high cholesterol, high blood pressure, insulin resistance, you name it, I had it. And I put myself on this diet. I called my parents, said, "Do you still have it?" And they said, "Oh, yeah." So I lost 50 pounds my first year and another 20 that I've kept off for over 20 years now. But what's interesting is when I looked at his supplements, lo and behold, he was taking supplements that I was using to protect the heart during heart surgery and heart transplantation, for which I was actually very famous. And so I was putting them down the veins and arteries, and it never occurred to me to swallow the dumb things. So I started swallowing a bunch of supplements, and I started teaching my patients who I operated on how to avoid me in the future. And lo and behold, changes in their cholesterol happened, changes in their blood pressure happened, their diabetes went away, etc. And so after about a year of doing this at Loma Linda, I said, oh my gosh, I've got this all wrong. I shouldn't be operating on people and then teaching them how to eat. I should teach them how to eat, and then I'll probably never have to operate on them. Now, that's a terrible career move as a heart surgeon. I mean, just one of the dumbest things, I ever did. But I literally resigned my position. And I said, And I set up a clinic in Palm Springs, and I also now have one in Santa Barbara, where I treated every patient as kind of my personal research project and said, look, here's certain foods I want you to eat. Here's certain foods I don't want you to eat. I want you to go to Costco or Trader Joe's and buy some supplements. There wasn't Amazon way back then. And let's see what happens. And I want to draw blood on you every 3 months, and Medicare or insurance will pay for it. And let's see. And I started publishing these papers. Actually, just before I got on the phone with you, I was writing an abstract for the American Heart Association on one of my discoveries. Anyhow, so kind of the rest is history. My most famous book was The Plant Paradox of about 4 years ago now, where kind of upended that maybe plants didn't like us as much as we all thought, and that certain plants might have it in for us. And, that's followed with the most recent book, which is The Energy Paradox. So there you go.
It's a great and unique story. I guess the second question related to that was, what was the response by your colleagues in the profession when you're making a break from, an extremely respected heart surgeon, the highest credential backgrounds, Ivy League, and now you are a quote unquote, I can imagine the derogatory nature, now you're a supplement salesman and a dietary advocate. What was that like professionally? Was there some people that supported you, or some people thought you had lost your mind?
Well, a little of both. Certainly when I lost all my weight and I was still going to cardiothoracic surgery meetings, the first question out of everybody's mind is, what kind of cancer are you suffering from? Um, and, good news, I wasn't suffering from cancer. I just, lost the weight I was supposed to lose. And some of my critics have called me a snake oil salesman. Now, actually, I take that with the highest honor. It turns out that snake oil, unbeknownst to these people, has actually the highest amounts of omega-3, long-chain omega-3 fatty acids of any oil, including fish oil. And even Scientific American has written an article that, snake oil is not snake oil. And,
That's so great.
so if someone wants to call me a snake oil salesman, I consider that a very high honor. Now, snake oil actually really did work for inflammation. And so, unfortunately, most snake oil eventually was not snake oil that was sold. And that's, of course, where the term comes from. But snake oil worked because it worked. And so there you go.
I love the historical aspects and the humor that you instill in that. I think, with your latest book, The Energy Paradox, that you've come out with, you're introducing some new concepts that people might not have understand. Can you kind of illustrate maybe some of the things, and I think we'll probably get into it here, is why so many people are feeling this exhaustion and chronic fatigue today?
Yeah, when I actually first, started what I call restorative medicine, some people call it functional medicine. So when I did this 20 plus years ago now, and I started seeing, quote, regular patients who didn't need heart surgery, there's codes we use called ICD-10 codes that we have to put down to bill. And I was finding that at least 50% of the patients I was seeing had fatigue and malaise as a code. And that is exactly what it sounds like. And I was actually impressed that many people I was seeing for other reasons, for heart disease, for diabetes. One of the main driving factors was fatigue and malaise. And in the process of teaching them how to eat and getting them some supplements, their fatigue and malaise went away, magically disappeared, magically. And so I wasn't planning to write this book, but a couple of years ago, just pre-COVID, I was heading into Orange County, south of LA, to do a PBS fundraiser thing that I was doing, which I like to do. And we were going to do a little, pitch on PBS, and this person was going to interview me. And I get a call on the cell phone that says, so-and-so isn't going to be able to make it in today. She just doesn't have it in her. And I'm going, no, is something wrong? They said, no, she's just exhausted. She doesn't have it in her. And don't worry, we'll get somebody else. And this was a millennial. And so we did the thing, but the fact that a millennial is calling in that they just didn't have it in them to come into work today really struck a chord. And I said, why is this person so depleted with energy? And I realized that, I was making people regain their energy through my program. So I figured, I better write a book about this. So to answer your question, one of the things I start with in the book is a fascinating study that was done by Duke University researchers. And I've actually had them on my podcast, the Dr. Gundry podcast. And what they wanted to do, it was actually an interesting hypothesis. They went and studied the Hadzas in Tanzania. They were one of the last hunter-gatherer tribes on Earth, and they've been extensively studied. And they're incredibly fit. They're skinny, they're healthy, they don't have any chronic diseases. The men walk 8 to 10 miles a day in search of game. The women walk 4 to 5 miles, digging up tubers, gathering berries, getting honey. And their proposition, their hypothesis was, we should compare the energy expenditure with these people who are moving around constantly with desk workers, sedentary desk workers here in America. And boy, are we going to find a big difference. Well, lo and behold, they found that the energy expenditure of these walking healthy Hadzas was exactly the same as the energy expenditure of all these people sitting at their desk. And in research, when we have a hypothesis and the results don't meet the hypothesis, we're actually supposed to throw the hypothesis out. But some of us don't do that. So their conclusion was, well, everybody, no matter what, has the exact same level of energy expenditure. And it doesn't matter if you're walking 10 miles a day or sitting at your desk, you're going to expend the same amount of energy. Now, quite frankly, that doesn't pass the sniff test. And so in my practice, when I would see someone with low energy, we would see all these markers of inflammation, such as HSCRP, fibrinogen, myeloperoxidase, a lot of autoimmune markers. And we would see, and I've actually published papers, that as we healed leaky gut, and hopefully we'll get into that, that these markers of inflammation subsided, became normal, and people's energy returned. So what was happening was that when you have inflammation, inflammation takes huge amounts of energy. And you literally have, if you will, the fire of inflammation. And we actually take energy away from muscles. We take energy away from the brain to fuel the troops, our immune system, that's producing this inflammation. And what I think these researchers at Duke were actually seeing was the Hanzas were using a lot of energy walking around, but they had absolutely no inflammation. But the people sitting at the desk, they were having huge energy expenditures, but it was going towards inflammation. And I think that's, the huge wake-up call that, of course, we're exhausted. Of course, our brain, is foggy. Of course, our muscles, we don't want to go do anything because all of our energy is devoted to this fire of inflammation.
So to summarize that, it would seem that in the case of these hunter-gatherers, they're using up their energy from, living life. Well, the people in the desks are using up their energy just trying to recover from the damage that they're doing. So they're both expending energy, but one's on trying to recover from the issues that you're doing, and the other one's just out doing their day. That's a profound statement, and which makes me kind of wonder, because there's a conundrum that has been presented through science and philosophy, and some people saying that you have a certain amount of breaths in you and you are going to die, and the other philosophy says that we can do these things to extend life. And then I heard another researcher by the name of Dr. David Hawkins says, well, the reason that you remember to take your vitamins and minerals is because you're divinely ordained to live to X numbers of days, not the other way around. What's your take on that whole story? Because I'm kind of resigned myself. Well, we can't necessarily ensure that we're going to live a long time, but we certainly can make sure that we live a high quality life. What's your iterations on that? Do you think that we can extend our lives, or that we can certainly improve the quality of our lives?
Yeah, both, actually. Mm-hmm. Dave Asprey and I like to have a little ongoing battle. Dave is significantly younger than me, and he's planning to live to 180. And I say that 150 is the new 100. So I'm going to arrive at 150 before Dave does, and then I'll wait for him. But not to be cute. So the original rate of living hypothesis, which you mentioned, was actually postulated back in the 1920s. And no matter how you define it, you only have so many heartbeats. That's one of them. You will eventually die from reactive oxygen species destroying your mitochondria. In the longevity paradox, there's actually really exciting information that our health span, how many years we're going to live healthy, and our lifespan is directly correlated to the integrity of the wall of our gut. And as long as the integrity of the wall of our gut is intact, then we will continue to do well and live well into our early hundreds at the very least, and that you can predict aging by looking at leaky gut. And certainly that's been shown over and over again. Recently, there was a researcher at the NIH where I was also a fellow for many years by the name of Dr. DeCabo. And Dr. DeCabo, I talk about DeCabo's mice in the energy paradox. And I think his discoveries are really exciting and answer your question in another way. So there were two, so calorie restriction has been proven to extend lifespan in all models tested, from worms to fruit flies to mice.
It's the one common element of longevity, right?
The one common element.
Yes.
Correct. And it was tested in rhesus monkeys by two groups of researchers, one at the University of Wisconsin and one at the NIH, the National Institutes of Aging. And they used different diets, but they had a calorie restriction of about 25 to 30%. Now, what's interesting is both groups showed that health span was dramatically improved. These monkeys, were youngsters as long as they lived. One group actually showed that the monkeys lived longer in the calorie restriction group. The other group didn't find it. And there's been arguments back and forth of why that is. I've argued, other people argued that the one group of monkeys that didn't live very long had more protein in their diet. And so people fight back and forth. DeCabo says, I got a different idea, and it's brilliant. He says, I think when you don't have a lot to eat and your food is set out for you, then you're probably going to eat your food really quickly. And there's going to be a considerable period of time every day where you're not eating. And I have a feeling it's the fact that these guys were fasting longer every day that made the big difference, not the fact that they had limited calories. So he said, I'm going to design an experiment with a bunch of mice, 300, and I'm going to divide them into two competing groups. One's going to get the University of Wisconsin food. The other group's going to get the NIH's food. And we're going to have three groups in each set. One's going to eat a full ration every day, and we're going to set it out, and they're going to eat 24 hours. Mice eat mainly at night. The other groups, we're going to set out their food at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. One group's going to be 25% calorie restricted, and the other group is going to get a full day's ration, but it's going to come late in the afternoon. And we're going to follow these mice. Lo and behold, first of all, they found that only the mice that got either calorie restricted or the full supply at 3 o'clock had metabolic flexibility. That means their mitochondria could use glucose as a fuel or free fatty acids as a fuel. They could make the switch back and forth, which is incredibly important. Some people know this as insulin resistance. Some people know this as pre-diabetes, but metabolic flexibility is incredibly important. The regular all-day munchers in either group had no metabolic flexibility. They couldn't make a switch between burning glucose or fat. That's number one. Number two, the calorie-restricted mice in each group lived about 25% longer, just like all the other experiments. And interestingly enough, it didn't matter whether they were a high protein group or kind of a high fat group. It didn't matter. But the most exciting part of the research is the folks who got a full day's ration but ate at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they only ate for about 10 to 12 hours. So the rest of the time they were fasting. They lived 11% longer than the mice that got the full day's ration but ate all day. Now, for you and I, that's a 10-year increase in lifespan.
Wow.
Wow. And what's really cool is the time controlled eating mice, the 3 p.m. feeding mice, in either group had no amyloid formation in any of their tissues. And amyloid ought to strike a little bell. That's highly associated with Alzheimer's and cognitive decline. They didn't produce it. So the long and short of the takeaway is it's probably not the sorts of foods that you're eating, but it's the timing of the eating and compressing your eating window that makes all the difference in how you're going to do.
Amazing. There's a couple of pieces I think that is really pertinent that we can kind of unpack in that, and that is why that is, and is it because of this leaky gut component, and that a lot of the damage that is over continuous eating is creating a problem as opposed to the restriction? That would be my suspicion. But can you unpack your definition of leaky gut and why the variance relative, because you kind of insinuated that, and I just want to flesh that out a little bit deeper for our listeners.
Yeah, so if you had asked me 15 years ago what I thought about leaky gut, I probably would have told you it was pseudoscience. But number one, we have now easily obtained blood tests, thanks to Dr. Alessio Fasano, who's now at Harvard, who discovered that lectins, one of my favorite subjects, and gluten happens to be a lectin, is a major cause of leaky gut. And he showed that you could produce gaps between the cells of our intestines simply by introducing gluten into animals and humans. And you could show that this caused inflammation and caused more damage. So Hippocrates, 2,500 years ago, said all disease begins in the gut. And the guy was right. He didn't have our sophisticated tests. Dr. Fasano has recently published a paper that says, the title is, All Disease Begins in a Leaky Gut. And I absolutely, completely agree with him. So leaky gut, and I talk a lot about it in the energy paradox, where it comes from, what we can do. Your listeners should know that the lining of our intestines is only 1 cell thick. And it's the same surface area as a tennis court. So when we're watching the French Open or the Wimbledon, it's that surface area inside of us. I mean, it's huge. Wow. And it's only 1 cell thick. And so it's, if you will, a design flaw. It's a good design flaw because we got to absorb everything through that. But these guys are actually held together. I'm old enough to remember a game called Red Rover, Red Rover.
I played that game myself, yes.
It's now banned from school as too dangerous.
Can you believe that? I mean, no, I had some of my most fun times, Rover, Red Rover, Sunwaydo, and you just...
Yeah, that's right.
They hauled you back. It was a lot of fun.
It was actually a lot of fun. And of course, you know, there's usually a big guy who pulled his knee up and the girls screamed, and but it was a lot of fun. Anyhow, so these cells are locked arm in arm like Red Rover, Red Rover. And what happens is you can actually break those crossed arms. And there's a space, a gap that occurs. And proteins can leak through, bacteria can leak through, and actually particles of food that would normally have been digested into smaller particles now leak through. And what's fascinating is 80% of all of our immune cells, our white blood cells, line our gut. 80% of them. Why? Because, quite frankly, that's where the mischief is going to come through. And so we, and when you have leaky gut, you start inflammation, and you start these white blood cells using up a huge amount of energy. And the other scary thing we now know is that if you have leaky gut, your immune cells in your gut send a message up to your brain that, hey guys, some bad actors are loose and you better protect your cells. And there's a bunch of bodyguards in our brain called microglial cells. They're literally the secret service agents of our neurons. And they actually begin creating inflammation in the brain, getting ready for these attackers that they think are coming. And sadly, we now know that if you have leaky gut, you probably have leaky brain, and we can measure leaky brain on blood tests. So, it's no wonder that, I see young women in their 20s who have brain fog. Now, yes. And it's one thing, to say, okay, he's 80 years old and he's, he doesn't remember things very well, or that's one thing. But a 25-year-old with brain fog, it's like, holy cow, what's going on here? And so when we look at these individuals and, kind of all their regular tests at the doctor's office are fine, and people go, it's all in your head. Well, guess what? It is in your head because you've got leaky brain and you've got neuroinflammation. And I write about this in The Energy Paradox and how it's connected.
This is a powerful statement because we see so many people struggling with cognitive capabilities. There's a lot of evidence of cognitive load and sitting in a sedentary lifestyle, staring into computer screens and the inflammatory response. But we can go into this leaky gut. And I believe there was a paper just recently released out of Harvard that suggested that virtually everybody has a certain percentage of leaky gut to
Yeah, that's Fasano.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's his paper.
Yeah. So what causes leaky gut, I guess? So, and how might someone avoid or minimize leaky gut? Because that would be the first thing. Like I think it was Susan Powter said one day, stop the insanity. So how do we first and foremost stop the damage?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And so I talk about in the Energy Paradox, the 7 energy disruptors. And one of the things, first thing people ought to know is the idea that eating an anti-inflammatory diet or taking anti-inflammatory supplements or throwing some turmeric root in your smoothie. You and I live in California, and that's the equivalent of fighting one of our forest fires with a garden hose, quite frankly. Mm-hmm. So what you have to do is stop the insanity. You have to stop the compounds that are actually causing leaky gut. So I've devoted my, current career into teaching people about lectins in foods. And these are plant proteins that Dr. Fasano has proven cause leaky gut. And gluten happens to be one of those plant compounds. There is a similar compound in oats that cross-reacts with gluten. About 70% of my patients who are gluten sensitive react to the proteins in corn with this same reaction. The nightshade family, tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, potatoes are part of these culprits. Peanuts and cashews have some really nasty lectins. So we get these things out of people's diets. Number 2, probably equally as important, is broad-spectrum antibiotics. Broad-spectrum antibiotics are not only used by us and given to us like candy by well-meaning physicians, but they're given to almost all of our animals in animal feedlots. And those antibiotic residuals are in the meats that we eat, and antibiotics, we didn't realize, kill off our microbiome. And the microbiome in and of itself is actually our first defense against leaky gut. We now know that the microbiome actually eats some of these troublemaking lectins, but probably equally importantly, they actually tell our immune system that, hey, we've got you covered. We've got the bad actors, they're going to meet us first. And you guys, if you're cops, go have a cigarette and a donut, and we've got this. And our immune system actually calms down. And I've published some papers of once we see a leaky gut, we've had about 90% of people, their immune system no longer reacts to, for instance, gluten. It's not interested in it anymore. So we can really retrain that. So antibiotics are way up there. Glyphosate, Roundup, was patented as an antibiotic. It was not patented as a weed killer. And glyphosate in and of itself will destroy our microbiome, but even more scary, glyphosate has been shown by itself to cause leaky gut. And glyphosate is everywhere. It used to be used on GMO crops, but now glyphosate is sprayed on almost all conventional crops prior to harvesting to dry the crop out and make it easier to harvest. If you look, it's in all of our oat products, all of our wheat products, it's in California wines. Almost all California wines have glyphosate because it was sprayed on weeds between the fields. So the idea that, we can eat, whole foods and be safe, glyphosate is everywhere. I recently ran a glyphosate level on a woman who actually owns a farm in Montana. And she's glyphosate level is one of the highest I've ever seen. And I said, you've been exposed to glyphosate. Oh, she said, oh yeah, we not only spray it on the fields, we carry it on our backs. We'll spray anything with glyphosate. It's harmless. And I'm going, maybe we ought to rethink that. Yeah.
Wow.
The other thing that's really important to realize is that non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, NSAIDs, like ibuprofen, Aleve, Advil, are absolute swallowing a hand grenade in terms of causing holes to appear in the lining of your intestines. And I'm not just saying that out of conjecture. It turns out that the drug companies, when these were introduced back in the 1970s, knew this. There's published papers about it. In fact, these were considered so dangerous that they were prescription only. And you could only take them for 2 weeks because they were so dangerous. And now, of course, people chew them like candy. We have, children's Advil. And just one of these things will create craters in the lining of your gut. And we just, again, take them like candy.
Wow. So it's safe to say that anybody listening to this podcast would have a certain amount of damage to some varying degree.
Correct.
Is there an epigenetic sensitivity? Like, in other words, some people are more sensitive to other foods than others. And then the other thing that I would come to would be, how do we determine that for an individual diet? And then the third piece would be, how do we repair said damage?
Yeah. So about 80% of my practice now is autoimmune diseases, where people have kind of been all over the country or world looking for help. And they end up in my clinic. And we have
exactly what your definition of an autoimmune disease. How would you classify it?
So, right now, the kind of standard autoimmune diseases, rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, lupus, erythematosus, Sjogren's syndrome, dry eye, dry mouth, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis. But we're beginning to realize that simple things like Coronary artery disease may absolutely be an autoimmune disease. Simple things like plain old arthritis may be an autoimmune disease. And the better and more sophisticated the tests we have of how the immune system attacks proteins that are native to us, I'm convinced that we'll probably realize that Hippocrates was right, that all diseases begin in the gut, including all of these, quote, natural processes of aging. So I published a paper that 94% of people who follow the Plant Paradox program have remission of their autoimmune disease within a year. And that's kind of held the course. It's the rare person that we can't get rid of their autoimmune disease. Hashimoto's thyroiditis. Kelly Clarkson is the most dramatic example. She never met me. I've met her subsequently, but she never met me. Somebody gave her the Plant Paradox book. She had Hashimoto's thyroiditis, was on thyroid medication, and she followed the book. Her Hashimoto was resolved. She lost 36 pounds. She got off of her medication. And that's a very typical story.
And very impressive. So you're saying just from the dietary changes, by stopping the inflammatory agents,
correct,
your body will naturally repair it. Is there any ways of accelerating that process or timelines? Because you're looking at, we're dealing with severe autoimmune disease. That's obviously the farthest end of the spectrum.
Correct.
How would it be for an average person?
Well, so
I hate that word, but
yeah, the average person. So there's clearly a genetic tendency to an autoimmune disease. It's not as strong as most people think. It can absolutely be overcome. So you're not going to be a lifelong, this is something I'm going to have to take this immunosuppressive drug that I use for heart transplants, to treat the heartbreak of psoriasis. Whenever I see these patients, and I see them all the time on these immunosuppressant drugs, first thing I do is I say, I didn't put a heart transplant in you. I didn't put a kidney transplant in you. What are you doing on a transplant drug? And they go, what are you talking about? I said, these are transplant drugs. They tell your immune system to, go away. And why do you want your immune system to go away? What you want to do is retrain your immune system to not get so crazy. Let me give you an example that I use in the book. 95% of us are born with an immunoglobulin, a preformed antibody to the peanut lectin. So 95% of us are born with that. It's genetic. And yet, when I was growing up, and I suspect when you were growing up, nobody had a peanut allergy. I mean, we had peanut butter jelly sandwiches at school. People are eating peanuts on airplanes.
Dry roasted Planters, peanuts, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, all that.
My dad would eat that stuff like it's candy.
And nobody was carrying EpiPens to school, right?
Right.
Now, kids are carrying EpiPens to school, and if there's peanut dust in the air, some kid's going to have an anaphylactic shock. What happened? Well, long ago, before broad spectrum antibiotics, before all this crazy foods that we've been eating, we had a great microbiome. We had no leaky gut. And now, of course, our immune system is on high alert 24 hours a day, and they see an innocent little peanut antigen, and they go, oh my gosh, we've got an antibody against that, attack. And so what was, an innocent little problem now has become this life-threatening condition, all because our microbiome's changed, our leaky gut has changed, and our immune system is on hyper alert. And the COVID cytokine storm is the perfect example of that. The people who got into trouble are the people who had pre-existing conditions. And those pre-existing conditions, even like hypertension, like diabetes, we now know underlies leaky gut. And that's just a sign of leaky gut.
very clear and succinct. So I want to kind of go to your statement earlier, which is 150 is the new 100, and then kind of cross correlating it with this story of leaky gut and then I guess restricted eating. So how have you postulated, based on your experience and your research, how we could potentially extend our life? Essentially, you're saying 50% from the upper ceiling,
Yeah.
potentially. And even if it's some derivative of that, I think that's great. And especially if it's a high quality existence, I think that's
Right.
even better.
Yeah.
So based on all this, I would love to see how you've postulated this process or this theory, and then what are the mechanics that people can engage in to kind of move towards that direction.
The Bioptimizer mission is to help more of the world fix their digestion at a core level. The truth is, your digestion is only as good as your enzyme levels. Imagine trying to build a house with a tree. It's impossible. You need to chop the tree down into small pieces. Similarly, in order for your food to be used by your body, it must be broken down into a bioavailable form. And that's what enzymes do, converting protein into amino acids, fats into specific fatty acids, and carbohydrates into usable energy units. We start out with an abundance of enzymes, and that's why kids can digest just about anything really quickly. The thing is cooking food kills enzymes, as they cannot survive at temperatures above 118 degrees. So years of this ends up depleting our bodies and leads to weak digestion. Taking digestive enzymes like masszymes, which has an incredibly high level of protease for digesting protein, as well as other critical enzymes like lipase, amylase, and others, is a total game changer. Suddenly, you strengthen your digestion, eliminate gas and bloating, boost metabolism, and multiply your energy. Most importantly, you fix your digestion at a core level. To get started with Masszymes and to save 10% on your first order, go to masszymes.com. That's MASSZYMES.com and use the code MASS10, MASS10.
A great question. It turns out I'm just this week putting to bed my next book, which is actually addressing your question. And it doesn't even have a title yet. We're still debating the title. It turns out that with each book, the longevity paradox really prompted my interest in keeping the wall of the gut intact. And one of the things that I really delve into in the energy paradox is one of the ways of keeping that wall intact is and you alluded to it, the less time we spend digesting, the less work that our intestinal tract has to do, the less exposure to potential mischievous foods that our intestinal tract has to deal with, then the less damage to the intestinal tract, period. And the longer we have for the gut wall to actually rest, the longer it has to repair itself. So, and I think DeCabo, proved that. One of the other things that I allude to in the energy paradox, which I think is very exciting, is an Italian athlete study of Italian cyclists. And the purpose of the study was to actually look at time-controlled eating, time-restricted eating. So they took these athletes and they gave them the exact same food to eat, and they divided them into two groups. One group had to eat all their food within a 12-hour time span. They ate breakfast at 8 o'clock in the morning, they had lunch at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and they had finished dinner by 8 o'clock. 12-hour eating span. The other group had break fast at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. They had lunch at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and then they had to finish dinner by 8 o'clock. So about a 7-hour eating window, about a 17-hour fasting window. So what they found was that both athletes had identical performance. They had identical muscle mass. The athletes that constricted their eating window lost weight. The other group did not lose any weight. And the most exciting thing, there's a marker, the best marker we have of aging is insulin-like growth factor, IGF-1. And it's a good stand-in for how activated or inactivated mTOR is, the mammalian target of rapamycin. And by the way, back in the dark ages, we researched rapamycin in transplant, and that's actually how we found this correlation. But anyhow, that's another story. So these guys, the guys who limited their eating window, their IGF-1 plummeted by like 50 points, which is dramatic. So the exciting thing is, and it's very much like DeCabo said, look, you can eat a lot of food, but if you compress that time period, all sorts of really cool things happen. And the new book that's not out yet, it'll be out March of 2022, will show you why that happened. And if I told you now, I'd have to kill you.
That's great. We'll get you back and specific to that. Now, one of the interesting things, and I'm just going to counter that in an aspect for what I would say longevity eating versus, say, the cosmetic in fitness industry, which if you look at, say, fitness competitors, bodybuilders, people, fitness enthusiasts, oftentimes they're breaking up their dietary meals over, say, somewhere between 4 and 6 meals a day over an extended period of time, small little mini meals to kind of string out stable their blood sugar, keep their caloric restriction down to hit a cosmetic goal. However, would you say that may be counteractive to living longer?
Yes.
Got it.
Period.
Now, is caloric restriction as good for getting into your cosmetic ideal conditioning? So what I'm trying to balance is people's desire to look a certain way versus be a certain way long term. How have you looked into that, or is that just?
Well, yeah. I mean, calorie restriction is still, the number way to extend lifespan.
Right.
The problem is it's nearly impossible to pull off for an extended period of time. Right. There is the Calorie Restriction Society of America, and there is.
Of course, there's a society. That's funny.
Of course, yeah. And they've been extensively studied by St. Louis University. And I'll give you actually an interesting thing I talked about in the longevity paradox. So they got these guys who are calorie restricted, and they asked them to go on a vegan calorie restricted diet. Same calories, but just eliminate all animal protein. And interestingly enough, they looked at IGF-1, and lo and behold, when they went from a calorie-restricted diet that included animal protein to eliminating animal protein, their IGF-1s dropped quite dramatically. So I think there's more here than just restricting calories. I think there's a lot of amino acid tricks that you can use to fool mTOR sensors, and I write about that in the longevity paradox. And there's, if there's a trick, I think I know it, but I'm always discovering a new trick thanks to my patients. But for instance, you can take pigs and put them on a methionine restricted diet. Methionine is much more prevalent in animal proteins than plant proteins. And these pigs eating the same amount of calories on a methionine restricted diet will live about 50% longer than pigs that aren't on a methionine restricted diet. So, there's lots of ways to skin a cat.
Right. I want to kind of go back to original topic that we opened up and never kind of flushed out, and that is the mitochondrial rush hour that you kind of talked about. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and what your most latest research is discovering?
Yeah. So mitochondria are the energy producing organelles in almost all of our cells. They're not in red blood cells, but that's another story. And these guys have the job of taking either glucose or amino acids or free fatty acids and converting them into our energy currency ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And they're actually pretty doggone good at taking any one of these substances and running it down the electron transport chain and arriving at ATP. And they're good at taking one thing at a time. And they're not really good at having sugars, proteins, and fats converge simultaneously to be made into energy. Now, why is that? Because way back when, our grandparents not only ate a whole food diet, but they actually ate food whole. And there's actually a very subtle distinction, or maybe a very important distinction, that they, for instance, they might have a sweet potato, but they didn't have sweet potato chips. And they certainly didn't have sweet potato pasta. So a big old sweet potato takes a considerable period of time for our digestive enzymes to break it down into sugars. And a lot of it is a resistant starch, which we can't even break down anyhow, and our gut microbiome gets the leftovers, and they say thank you. Same thing when they chowed into a steak. It took a huge amount of time to break the steak into individual amino acids that could be absorbed. And the same thing with fat. Fat actually has to be absorbed not directly into the bloodstream. It actually is absorbed into the lymph system and then takes a circuitous route around the body. But now, thanks to processed food and ultra-processed food, we've got individual sugar molecules, individual amino acids, and finely refined fatty acids all combined into this incredibly wonderful energy bar or protein powder, or you name the silliness. And we eat it for energy. But the problem is now all of these energy producing compounds, which would have arrived very slowly. Glucose would have arrived first. After that, amino acids, hours afterwards, would arrive later, and fats way after that. Now, all of these guys, it's like living in LA and you're in Venice. You've got rush hour on the 405, 16 hours a day. And the average American is, Dr. at the Salk Institute in outside of San Diego, they've shown that the average American now is eating 16 hours a day, and they're doing these little snacks of energy foods.
Right.
And it is rush hour in our mitochondria, and it's literally it's no wonder that we actually, our energy production goes down. It is a traffic jam.
Powerful statement. And so in combination to eating, a variety of these foods, which is creating leaky gut, you're getting an autoimmune response. You're eating too long. You're overloading the mitochondria. You're delivering all of these energy sources simultaneously. The combination of all these things is essentially leading to people and our quote unquote millennial person not up for it.
Yeah. And, one of the things that's interesting, millennials are actually the first generation that have been exposed to all of these things simultaneously.
Right.
They've been exposed to processed foods. They've been exposed to antibiotics throughout their lives. They've been exposed to glyphosate for their entire lives. And, they're really the first full generation that has been bombarded with 365 days of fruit. And I talk about this and I get a lot of grief about it. Fructose is one of the best energy disruptors ever invented. Fructose is a toxin. It's a mitochondrial toxin. It actually prevents ATP generation. And I detail this in the book. And long ago, we ate fruit in the summer and early fall to gain weight for the winter. In fact, there are huge textbooks showing that great apes only gain weight during fruit season. And believe it or not, fruit only ripens once a year in the jungle. And they do that because winter and spring is a time of less food. And, it's good to have a little fat on board. But now our fruits have been hybridized for sugar content. For instance, an apple has more fructose than a full-size Hershey's candy bar. There's more fructose in a cup of grapes than a full-size Hershey's candy bar. And I can tell you what I'd probably rather have. But I'm not going to. You didn't hear. And so, as I show in the book, fructose it's so dangerous that it's taken directly to the liver. Do not pass go, do not collect $200 instead of going into the bloodstream. And the liver detoxifies fructose into triglycerides, which is the first form of fat from sugar, and uric acid. Uric acid is what causes gout. And there's a brand new paper showing that uric acid is one of the best producers of metabolic syndrome, and that fructose is the best producer of fatty liver. And we now have this incredible epidemic of fatty liver. And everybody's going, well, where'd that come from? Well, it came from, we've got fructose in everything now, and not just high fructose corn syrup. I mean, fruit smoothies are just this modern crazy invention that didn't exist. And fruit juices, the millennials were really kind of the first, second generation to be exposed to fruit juices as healthy. And I tell my patients, look, if you think juice is healthy, let's go down to the San Diego Zoo or the LA Zoo and look at all the cages. You're not going to find a juicer.
Beautifully said. So what does a day in the life look like for you from a dietary practice that would lead you to what you are gunning for, 150-year-old age? How does that look? How have you maybe adapted your diet over time and are following it today? I think that people would be very interested in that.
Yeah, so as far as I know, and anybody can correct me, nobody has yet, I'm the first person to write about intermittent fasting as a dietary practice. And I wrote about it in my first book, Dr. Gundry's Diet Evolution, which was written back in 2006, long before anybody ever talked about this. And I'll tell you a humorous story because I love repeating it. My editor at the time, what was at Random House, and I had an entire chapter on intermittent fasting, time-restricted eating. And at that time, I was practicing since the year 1999, during the winter, from January through June. During the week, I was consuming all of my calories in a 2-hour window. That's now called an OMAD diet, one meal a day. Yep. And I would do that from January to June. And I was doing that because I was attempting to emulate what our ancestors probably did. There wasn't a lot of food in the winter. And then in the summer, I went back to my usual practice of eating 2 meals a day. So I've been doing that now for 21 years, 22 years now. And so I had all of the research, why time restricted feeding is so important, why it does all these benefits. And my editor, Heather Jackson, said, you're crazy enough. This is too crazy. We're cutting it. I said, no, don't do this. You'll regret it. This is really, really important. She said, all right, I'll give you 2 pages to make your case. And you can actually find the 2 pages. And so I ran into her at a Mind Body Green symposium that I was talking at pre-COVID. And she was there in the audience. She comes running up to me. She said, congratulations on, all your success. And she says, I have an apology to make. She said, I told you to cut all that out about intermittent fasting. She said, I should have realized you were so far ahead of your time. She said, will you accept my apology? And I said, yeah, but it still, burns on me. So, yeah, so I've been living that now for over 20 years. And every year I do that. We'll find out. Jack LaLanne, I got to know late in his life. He, as far as I'm concerned, is the godfather of fitness. And I'll fight anybody to the death that says otherwise. But anyhow.
Remarkable individual.
Yeah, he really was. And I got to pick his brain. And, he used to have this expression, if it tastes good, spit it out. Yeah. and actually all my people who advise me say, please don't say that. You'll make people think that eating the way you want them to eat tastes bad. And I said, no. He wasn't actually saying that. He was saying that we should be eating for our microbiome and not for this dumb 2x3 inch piece of muscle. And long before anybody knew about the microbiome. And quite frankly, a lot of vegetables that are really good for you are bitter. And one of my first expressions in the Dr. Gundry's Diet Evolution is more bitter, more better. And you look at long-lived societies and these bitter compounds, which I talk a lot about in the upcoming book, and I've talked in the past, these polyphenol compounds may really hold a lot of secrets to health span and longevity.
It's a big aspect of Ayurvedic medicine and talking about getting the 5 different palatable foods on your plate. And bitter and pungent are 2 particular food groups, which is largely in part avoided in Western cuisine, which is very common in Asian cuisine, which is very interesting. I traveled both places, and we're focused on salt and sugar. Essentially, that's the 2 things.
That's right.
Why do you suppose that is? Is there a natural aspect of consumption or increase in consumption from salt and sweet tasting foods as opposed to bitter or pungent?
Well, it's interesting. The original spice trade in the Middle Ages was actually devoted to very pungent and bitter spices, and people would pay huge amounts of money for them. They were a drug. But then that was when the New World was discovered, and sugar, which was a super expensive drug, became a cheap drug. Then sugar in Western society, because of its cheapness, rapidly replaced these spices as the drug of choice. And any white powder is a drug. We've learned that by now. And you take, and again, this gets back. Cassava as a root is actually pretty doggone good for you. It's got a lot of benefits. But if you grind it up into a cassava flour and then you start baking with it, I still see people not realizing that now it's a white powder, and just be careful of white powders.
So, in your own dietary practice now, are you cognizant of how many calories, or are you cognizant of what type of foods you just eat till you're full? How does that work for you?
So I'll give you one of the exciting examples from the energy paradox. There's always been research about, where does hunger come from? And the original research was looking at stretch receptors in the stomach. And there was really cool, fun stuff of having women and men swallow a balloon with a little tube attached to it. And you'd blow up the balloon until, somebody cried uncle. And the women, when the balloon would get to about the size of an apple, they go, oh, that's uncomfortable. Oh, stop. Guys, you could blow the balloon up to a basketball, and the guys would go, oh, yeah, oh, that's great, yeah. Love it. So that was kind of the gut stretch theory. And then as sophisticated blood tests came along, you could find gut hormones that would, decrease or increase satiety. And then leptin came into vogue, the anti-hunger hormone. And then ghrelin was discovered, which was the hunger hormone. And that kind of was where things stopped. CCK, was discovered. So there was some Chinese researchers that said, we're now discovering the microbiome. And I'll bet you the microbiome and its needs controls hunger. And it became the gut-centric theory of hunger. So they took people and put them on a 7 or 14-day water fast. But they gave them 100 calories per day of prebiotic fiber. We can't digest prebiotic fiber, but our gut bacteria, that's what they live on. And they found that even with a 14-day fast, these volunteers had no hunger as long as they were given the prebiotic fiber. The people who weren't given prebiotic fiber were hungry as the dickens for a few days, and then that subsided. But the point of all that is, I've been telling my patients for years and years, just like Jack LaLanne said, if you eat for them, your microbiome, they will take care of you. And they will direct literally everything that happens to you, including your taste for foods. It shocked me early on when my meat and potato guys, after a few weeks of me forcing them to eat salads and vegetables, they'll come back in a couple of months and, this is weird. I don't know what's happening to me. I crave salads. I used to hate salads. What's happening to me? I can't go a day without, a salad, and you're ready to kill to get a salad. I said, that's because your brain has been taken over by these good gut bugs, and they're commanding you to give them what they need to eat. It's really funny.
It is. It's really great. Do you make any focus on particular types of essential fatty acids or these type of things? Because that's a big debate out there in the world. How much saturated fats or omega-3s, omega-6s, all this sort of stuff. Do you put any attention on that inside of your own diets or your dietary?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So when we measure the omega-3 index, which looks at about a 2-month consumption of DHA and EPA, the long-chain omega-3 fats, most people are profoundly deficient in them. And as I write in the energy paradox and in the longevity paradox, that if you look at people who have the highest omega-3 levels by the omega-3 index, as they age, they have their biggest brains and they have the biggest memory centers, the hippocampus, compared to people who have the lowest omega-3 index. They have the most shrunken brains and the smallest areas of memory. There's also some beautiful work out of Japan that shows the same thing is true of arachidonic acid, that evil omega-6 fat that everybody, tars and feathers as the ultimate inflammatory fatty acid. In fact, the Japanese research shows that people who have the highest levels of arachidonic acid also have the biggest brains. And a Texas University study showed that forcing athletes to take arachidonic acid supplements actually reduce their levels of inflammation. Now, people go, no, that can't be. So your brain is about 70% fat, and half of the fat is DHA, the long chain omega-3 fat. The other fat is arachidonic acid, folks. And so we have, a chain trying to take short chain omega-3 fats and make them long chain omega-3 and omega-6 fats. Most of us in our modern diet are way overloaded with short chain omega-6 fats like linoleic acid. And most of us don't get any long chain omega-3 fats. And this mechanism for building omega-3 fats, long chain, have been hijacked by all of these short chain omega-6 fats trying to move up the totem pole. So number one, don't be afraid of arachidonic acid. Have yourself some egg yolks. It's a great source of arachidonic acid. Have yourself some shellfish. It's a great source of omega-3 and omega-6 fats. And in the new book, I'm going to talk about odd chain saturated fats that probably most people have never heard of. And I won't take the time to go into it today.
Sweet. We'll set that up for a future discussion. In this book, The Energy Paradox, and I'm going to suggest everybody pick up a copy. We'll put some components in the show notes. What is your hope that people take away from this, and what would you like to see happen as an overall implementation? Because obviously you've dedicated your life to, helping people live healthier, live longer, and have a longer or a healthier life with the age that they have. And you've outlined some beautiful things here. What's the takeaway that you want for people in regards to this? And
well, like Ariana Huffington said in the introduction, what I want you to know is that fatigue is not your fate. And I think so many of us in our modern lifestyle have just accepted that, that fatigue and exhaustion and pushing through it is something that we just have to do. It's part and parcel of our modern crazy, hectic lifestyle. And that's not true. I've chased 90-year-old Sardinian goat herders up a hill. And, I can't even keep up with these guys. And it's like, anybody told you ought to be, sitting in a rocking chair? And, I've got a 95-year-old gentleman from LA who carries the Alzheimer's gene. He's 97. I think he just turned 98. He runs his company. He has 3 daughters who will not let him retire, good thinking, because he's so good at it. And, and he doesn't want to retire. So, and he's 98 now. It's like, that's what I want for us. That's, you look at these elders in the blue zones that I visit, and I lived in the only blue zone in the United States, Loma Linda, for much of my career. These are healthy old people. They're my oldest patient, Edith Murray, who I dedicated the Longevity Paradox. She died in her sleep 2 weeks before her 106th birthday. And she would walk into my office. There's a picture in the Longevity Paradox in 2-inch high heels at 105, I kid you not, with the most beautiful full head of hair. And that's what I want for all of us. And, and it's possible.
I had the good fortune of when I was a young boy, I met a fellow in our church by the name of Mr. Harvey Rogers, who was 106 years old at the time, and I was 6. And we were literally 100 years apart. And I just wanted to sit next to him too, because I would imagine, wow, what an amazing thing. And I had an extended good fortune that I had in my little street, Fairview Avenue in Hillsborough, New Brunswick. There's been 3 centurions within a stone's throw of my existence. One who's living today at 103 years old. And my mom takes care of her, some of her activities. And she's still out today. She doesn't have very good use of her legs, but she's out and she'll drag herself around and work on her fence. And she she carries her own wood into the furnace. And I think this version that you get to a certain age and suddenly you're done. And we're just going to put you in an easy chair and you sit back and that's it. And now you live the good life is maybe the most damaging myth of our society. And I think more than anything else, people such as yourself who have dedicated your life into the service of others, but are living examples of what our younger generation needs to embrace and understand, because it's been my observation that people senior to myself are living a higher quality life, even though many people would think that, oh, they're an old timer or they don't know what they're talking about. They're not as digitally adept or they're not this or that. And none of that is legitimate or true in the fact that we can live a long, robust life. Any final words and where people can get a hold of you? Find out about your information, your clinics, your next upcoming books. Please let it loose for everybody to find you. This has been a remarkable interview, and I want people to dive.
Well, so just personally, I'm 71 years old now. I work 7 days a week. I see patients 6 days a week in my 2 clinics. On Fridays, I'm at my supplement company, Gundry MD. So I literally, I should be retired, but I'm like a kid in a candy store. So at 71, if I can work 7 days a week and enjoy it, there's hope. My great grandmother, who I lived nearby, lived in a 3-story house, and she raised all her kids. And she had her bedroom on the 3rd floor of this 3-story house. And my sister and I, we'd go over there and we'd visit her quite a bit. She actually cared for one of my spinster aunts, and she always, walked up to her bedroom on the 3rd floor several times a day. And my sister and I would go, Grandma, what are you doing that for? Why don't you, move your bed down to the 1st floor? Looking back, what a genius. She's like all the blue zones actually live in hilly communities. And, my grandmother was walking up and down stairs, and she died 2 months before her 100th birthday. So she was, doing the right thing. So it's never too late to make a change, I can assure everybody. So you can find me, you can get my book wherever books are sold. Please go to your local bookseller. They've been really hurting from COVID and can use your help. You can find me at drgundry.com. You can find me at Gundry MD, my supplement and food company. Find me at the Dr. Gundry podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. We're now part of Podcast One, so we're really excited about that. And I got 2 YouTube channels, Instagram, Twitter. And if hopefully I show up on your emails every morning. Sign up for my daily email at gundrymd.com.
Well, this has been a real joy and a real pleasure. You've communicated this information in such an eloquent way. I really appreciate you taking the time for joining us today on the Awesome Health Podcast. I wish you the best of success, and please let us know when the new book is out as well, because I'd love to get back and uncork some of these new discoveries, obviously you're ahead of the curve on a lot of things, and will continue to follow and track your career.
Very good. Yeah. Each new book is actually comes out of some crazy thing I discover in writing the current book, or something that, in researching my patients over the last few years, just pops out and go, holy cow, this is why this is happening. And there you go.
It's so exciting to be continuing and discovering all these new things, and it's really great that you're doing so. So for all our listeners, there you have it, Dr. Stephen Gundry and all his wisdom. Please check out his new book, The Energy Paradox, all of his sites and information to stay up to date on the latest and breaking news. Thanks so much for joining us today. Really appreciate you on this episode. Take care.
At Bioptimizers, our mission is to fix digestion. And a cornerstone of digestion is gut flora. P3OM is our patented probiotic formula. In fact, we call it the Navy SEALs of probiotics. You see, strong proteolytic or protein digesting activity is paramount to having a healthy gut flora. And of course, P3OM provides that. The good news is, unlike weaker probiotics, P3OM survives the digestion process. What it does is it basically multiplies the good guys while protecting you against pathogens, or what some people call the bad guys. P3OM really helps to rebuild your digestion. And what that allows you to do is to maximize nutrient uptake, energy, and metabolism. To find out more of how P3OM can help you, go to www.bioptimizers.com.
Thank you for listening to the Bioptimizers Awesome Health Podcast. You can find more information at bioptimizers.com.